Hi, everyone. Thanks for sticking around for our final presentation of the day. So once again, my name is Erin McCaddy, Momoe Erin McCaddy. My pronouns are she and elle, and I will be the moderator for this final session, Certificates of Presence, Authorial Portraits in the Orientalist Travelogue, which will be given by Stéphanie Hornstein, this year's Concordia Library Researcher in Residence. So once again, for the benefit of those watching the recordings, we are gathering today in Tiohtià:ke or Montreal on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation. However, since you are watching in the future from possibly a different place, I would encourage you to learn more about the Indigenous peoples who are the guardians of the lands and waters near you by consulting nativeland.ca. Once again, this session will be 20 minutes, followed by a 10-minute question and answer period. And questions can be asked either at the microphone in the room or via the Padlet anonymously. And once again, we'll have that QR code up during the Q&A period. So thank you for being here, and I'll hand things over to Steph.
Great, thanks, Erin. And thank you to all of you for sticking around till the last presentation. As Erin said, I'm this year's researcher in residence at Concordia Library, but I'm really joining you from the world of art history. I'm a PhD candidate in the art history department at Concordia, and this is my very first library conference, which has completely exploded what and preconceived notions that I had of what a library conference might have looked like. I mean, we've talked about legal papers and census records and impact factor. You know, all this has been really wonderful to learn about. In any case, this presentation will be about books. And I will be reading from my paper to make sure that I stick to time. Victorian travelogues are an important source of historic pictures. This is something that I have learned in my many years of researching early travel photographs of Egypt and Japan. While I initially turned to these books as textual sources that could tell me more about what travelers experienced on their journeys abroad, I soon realized that they were vehicles of photographs in their own right. Thank you. Ooh. My work revolves around travelogues that could be called Orientalist. That is, they present a Eurocentric or a Western perspective on Asian and Middle Eastern countries. In these romantic and frequently imperialist accounts, far-off lands are ideologically positioned as the binary opposite of an ordered, modern, and moral Occidental civilization. While travelogues had long been illustrated with engravings, the advent of half-tone printing technology towards the end of the 19th century would enable publishers to reproduce photographs in books with large-scale print runs. As a result, a mutually sustaining relationship would develop between text and image, in which photographs, widely taken for truthful slices of reality, validated the views expressed by the travel writers. For today's presentation, I would like to hone in on an aspect of illustrated travelogues that I find especially telling, and that's author portraits. Sometimes featured as frontispieces, sometimes peppered throughout a book, depictions of authors fulfilled a slightly different task from other illustrations. They put a face to the writerly voice of the publication. In doing so, photographic portraits assisted authors in establishing and maintaining a distinctive persona, something that was becoming a professional necessity by the 1880s due to a veritable boom in book production. To keep pace with an increasingly competitive market, Victorian publishers, as literature scholar Marissa Demore has remarked, and I'm quoting her, began to sell authors first and their books second. This industry shift was particularly marked in the case of travelogues, which, as a literary genre, presents a given place seen through the eyes of a specific interpreter. It's perhaps no surprise, then, that Carl Thompson, in his survey on travel writing, notes a pronounced inward turn in the Victorian era that contributed, and I'm quoting him, to shifting attention away from the scenes being witnessed and onto the narratorial self that was doing the witnessing. End quote. The author portrait thus represented a complementary visual means for emphasizing the witnessing subject and building up their reputation. In his often cited lecture, What is an Author?, Michel Foucault provocatively advanced that the name on the cover of a book was merely one semantic sign among others. But rather than reject the author as an invalid lens of interpretation, as his contemporary Renan Barthes did, Foucault proposed that the linguistic codes that make up what he termed the author function could be productively explored in order to uncover the discursive politics of a given piece of writing. In other words, he encouraged researchers to determine how the idea of author was conveyed and what power this conferred on the person that claimed authorship of the text. Portraits of writers may not exactly be elements of language, but they do interact with it in intimate and sometimes subliminal ways. Moreover, in their very assertive, and one might even say strident projection of authority, they positively cry out for Foucauldian dismantling. So it seems appropriate, borrowing the concept of the author function, to ask how these photographic images contribute to the discursive structures of the publications in which they are embedded. My contention is that these pictures operate as certificates of presence, as alleged proof that the testimony contained within the travelogue is indeed grounded in experiential knowledge. As the success or failure of Orientalist travelogues was frequently judged on the writer's ability to evoke a supposedly authentic vision of the East, authors needed to convince their audience not only that they had visited the foreign lands under discussion, but that they had engaged meaningfully with them. Photography was thus regularly enlisted by these writerly tour guides in their performance of the intrepid traveler. Some, as you can see here, showed themselves mingling with the local populace, having their fortunes told or being wheeled around in a carriage. Or in the case of Herbert Ponting, who you can see on the far right, manfully photographing his Japanese assistants at the lip of the Aso volcano. Whether feeding camels or ascending pyramids, the subjects in these images are pictured in direct contact with their surroundings, and often with the servants and guides that enabled their mobility. Records of the sort, which are enlivened by a snapshot immediacy only made possible thanks to the recent innovation of the handheld camera, positioned the author as an active agent with tales to tell. In many instances, they illustrate episodes narrated by the text, providing visual corroboration that events took place as described. By portraying themselves in the field, authors asserted ownership over the first-person perspective of the travelogue, while also exhibiting their intimacy with exotic cultures. Another type of portrait, which makes the same kind of claim differently, can be found in images that show writers in so-called Oriental dress. These photographs make visually manifest a popular custom that current scholarship terms cultural cross-dressing. This academic label is a capacious one that encompasses all forms of sartorial transgressions, whether they are born out of glamorous revelry, bigoted parody, earnest exchange, or practical necessity. For the sake of this presentation, I want to attend to the kind of authorial personalities put forward through these acts of dress-up. Compared to images of the author snapped on the go, cultural cross-dressing portraits were more elaborate presentations of self that involved costumes, props, sets, and often required the assistance of a professional photographer to kind of manage all this. Frequently printed as frontispieces, or in the case of Elizabeth Cooper, glued right onto the cover of the book, costume portraits were often introductory images that set the tone for the rest of the publication. From this vantage point, they announce the author's commitment to their journey, and by extent to the reader. Cooper, for instance, states in her preface that she was able to learn so much about Egyptian life because she took on employment as a housekeeper during her stay in Cairo. Though she appears elsewhere in the book in Western dress, it seems likely that she chose an image of herself in Egyptian clothes for the cover because she wished to convey her profound level of immersion in local customs from the get-go. Others used costume portraits to display wisdom that they had acquired abroad. Lady Lawson, for example, who's here on the left, included a photograph of her à la japonaise in her travelogue, to which she appended the following informative subtitle, and I'm quoting: The kimono should be folded from left to right. It is only arranged from right to left in the case of a dead person, end quote. This, according to a later chapter in the book, Lawson had learned the hard way when she first tried on a kimono and was told by a mortified host that she was wearing it incorrectly. By admitting her own gaucherie, Lawson shows herself to be generous with her knowledge and keen to preserve her reader against a similar faux pas. Should they ever decide to slip into a kimono, they could look to this photograph as an example that could be safely emulated. Through this combination of image and text, Lawson plays the part of the solicitous, worldly-wise expert, one who is qualified to impart cultural information based on her willingness to grapple with the unfamiliar, to make mistakes, and to learn from them. This particular use of the author portrait was in line with travelogue conventions that emphasized the writer's inner development. Travel had been considered an important means of self-betterment ever since the era of the Grand Tour, that aristocratic tradition of undertaking a journey through key destinations in continental Europe. By broadening their horizons, individuals were seen to acquire a cosmopolitan refinement as well as an appreciation of life's cruder realities. Douglas Sladen's costume portrait, he's on the right, certainly lays claim to such a transformative experience. Captioned, "The author in his Arab dress," the image echoes passages in Sladen's writing which find him pulling strings to enter mosques, bartering in the souks, and constantly lampooning the less adventurous tourists who preferred organized tours and hotel life. Though it is unlikely that Sladen would have undertaken any of these activities clothed this way, the costume portrait included in his travelogue was contrived to underscore his daring as well as his openness to new experiences. Through it, Sladen intimated that he, unlike others, was eager to commune with what he described as the streets of the undiluted Orient, and to find himself changed in the process. Similarly to other writers, Sladen advised his readers where they might purchase attractive foreign clothes. However, few travelers actually recount the experience of sitting for a costume portrait. Perhaps this is not surprising, seeing as doing so might reveal the formulaic artificiality of the procedure. Indeed, posing in a photographer's studio rarely procured a moment of heightened engagement with the undiluted Orient. Rather, what clients found in these establishments were safely westernized environments, complete with dressing rooms filled with European furniture that were often managed by equally European proprietors. And I'm hoping you can get a bit of a sense of that from this image. It's an advertising pamphlet from the Tamamura studio, and you can see the dressing room down there. It looks, I hope you can see, but it looks no different really from a Victorian parlor. To sit before the lens, costumed and surrounded by props, was to be acutely aware of the full extent of fabrication that went into a cultural cross-dressing portrait. To write about it candidly ran the risk of dispelling the very sense of proximity with the exotic that the author was desirous to achieve. Still, some writers, like Charles M. Taylor, who's on the far left, chose to relate their visit to the photographers. Having called on Kusakabe Kimbe's studio in 1898, Taylor gave the following account. And this studio was in Yokohama, Japan. He says, "We enter with our guide, who's probably the man on the far right, and upon making known our wishes, are shown upstairs to a dressing room where a charming little Japanese girl dresses the foreign ladies in Japanese costume. A Japanese gentleman is also engaged to attire the men. This assistance is quite necessary. When dressed, we are told to sit Japanese fashion, that is, to cross the legs under one, and we remain in this uncomfortable position until our photographs are taken." There are several items of interest in this brief making of narrative. Firstly, the Japanese assistants were hired by studios to help patrons into kimonos, and that, despite the final appearance of the image, the whole process might feel rather bewildering to the sitter. Far are we from a description of an author who is totally at ease in unfamiliar surroundings. Taylor, of course, was not obliged to disclose any of his discomfort to readers, so we might wonder if there was any advantage in doing so. Ironically, I believe that Taylor used his experience of Japanese clothing to reaffirm his own cultural identity. In qualifying the Japanese sartorial assistance as quite necessary, and in describing his awkwardness at sitting cross-legged on the floor, he emphasized the differences that separated him, a Western subject, from the habits and customs of Japanese people. While such comments may appear trivial, they are part and parcel of a discourse that positions the Oriental as what Ali Vedad has called a not I, a cultural other whose alterity is here reinforced by the challenges that the Westerner encounters in impersonating them. Can you still see the images all right? Yeah? In addition to marshaling props and costumes into striking representations of self, commercial photographers were able to accommodate more narrative mise-en-scène. A very popular photo op in Japan, for example, was to be pictured in a jinrikisha or rickshaw. Many travelogues contain images of their authors being carted around by stoic-looking Japanese men who, with their legs positioned to suggest movement, have been called into the studio to play act the serviceable laborer. The unbridled thrill of jinrikisha rides, which was a trope featured in virtually all Western accounts of Japan, was comparatively subdued in these images due to the stillness required by photography. These stagings were, nevertheless, appealing tokens of experience because they functioned as succinct metaphors for travel itself, a rather cosseted form of travel, that is. Premised on intercultural hierarchies of the lordly tourist and the toiling worker, the jinrikisha portrait cast authors in the role of the self-assured imperialist. Such illustrations frequently accompanied advice on how best to deal with the native laborers, who in turn were often described as brute beasts of burden. John L. Stoddard, who you can see at the bottom left here, even referred to his jinrikisha pullers as steeds, right? So making this connection between them and horses. While quick to poke fun at himself, this photograph is after all captioned a big wheeled baby carriage, Stoddard's commentary was typical in securing him the position of the roving observer, whose economic and social privileges enabled him to cover ground without having to exert himself. This portrait, in which he appears cross-dressed and wielding a fan, brings together two powerful symbols of cosmopolitan worldliness, the costumed traveler and the transported traveler. In Egypt, the comparable trend was to be photographed riding a camel. This was most frequently carried out when tourists visited the Giza Plateau. Here again, a local means of conveyance was employed as a synecdoche for the traveler author's adventure as a whole. The frontispiece of Grace Thompson Seton's A Woman Tenderfoot in Egypt is quite representative in this respect. Situating the writer in an instantly recognizable setting, the image deploys a veritable regiment of Orientalist tropes. The time-hewn monuments of ancient civilization, a desert horizon, an exotic animal, and significantly, a subservient local man. Notice how the camel and its keeper are elided in the image's caption that simply refers to the author, channeling all the grandeur in this photograph towards Seton's act of self-fashioning. For obvious reasons, it was rather difficult to get camels into the photographer's studio. And by the turn of the century, Westerners were less likely to don Egyptian clothing outside the confines of private spaces. But even though these camelestrian portraits rarely show sitters in native attire, I would argue that the very act of riding one of these creatures was considered cross-cultural. Seton, for one, was certainly enchanted by her mount's fine accessories, which she described in sartorial terms. Adelia, she says of the camel pictured here, was fitted with, and I'm quoting her, a luxurious saddle covered with an oriental rug of silky softness and ornamented with embroidered saddlebags with much knotted and befringed worsted wool of bright colors, end quote. Riding Adelia thus meant coming into close contact with these gorgeous raiments, and to some degree, making them one's own. Perched atop this ship of the desert, Seton also appears to profess an embodied understanding of the landscape, which comes from traveling it not by train or by automobile, as was already possible in Seton's time, but by an indigenous means of transport that required hired help. Demonstrating a oneness with foreign environments could also be effectively staged in a more domestic realm. This is exemplified in an image that appears early on in Henry Norman's The Real Japan. It depicts the author on the left sitting in a kimono on the veranda of a house. Captioned "At Home in Japan," this illustration is inserted into a chapter that details Norman's firsthand experience of Japanese domestic life, and in particular of the house that he was loaned during his stay. The text outlines those features of the property that most struck his Western sensibility as delightfully strange: the matted floors absent of furniture, the mobile walls, the fast-growing bamboo in the garden. The geisha, which Norman encounters as entertainers engaged for formal evenings, receives special mention. "Tiny creatures of fairyland they are," Norman gushes affectionately, "true visitors from the Oriental wonderland." The chapter concludes with a description of the bedtime rituals that allow this British guest to slip, and I'm quoting, "from the waking dream of being at home in Japan into that land of other dreams where alone every wanderer is in truth at home," end quote. And the portrait of the kimono-clad Norman gives visual expression to this ethereal sentiment. The borders of the image dissolve with a mist-like quality, and whole sections of the picture plane have been overlaid with impressionist brushstrokes. While this aesthetic intervention was at least in part an attempt to improve poor quality snapshots, what could be more appropriate than this altered photograph to illustrate what is essentially an account of the author playing house? As the foremost element of this image, Norman's figure operates as an intermediary, beckoning the reader into this dreamland that they are asked to recognize as the real Japan, despite it appearing too incredible to be true. I bring up Norman's portrait by way of conclusion because it strikes me as the ultimate bid for Orientalist connoisseurship. For here, the author presents himself not only as immersed, but perfectly integrated to this Eastern lifestyle. And the photograph, though operating as underpainting, is brandished as a certificate of this lived experience. The image also evinces the relational function that is at the core of all author portraits, and that is, as Martha Langford has succinctly put it, an invitation to the experience. This, however, was an invitation that readers were free to take or leave. And in fact, several reviewers of Norman's book expressed outright skepticism at his ability to capture the essence of the real Japan, labeling him nothing more than a transient tourist, or recasting his work as Japan of the journalist. The reservations about Norman's authority serve as an important reminder that no matter how indissoluble photography's relationship to the real might be, author portraits are projections that can be decoded for what they are: self-promotional attempts at enhancing the integrity and market allure of a publication. It is in this way that they contribute to the Travelogue's author function as compelling, but not invincible, attestations of character. Thank you.
So we can open the question period, and once again, you can come up to the microphone, or if you are stuck in the middle of a row, please raise your hand and I will bring you the mic.
Can't help but ask. I think I'm asking this question based on thinking of contemporary versions of this too. I'm wondering if that like collides or particle smashes anything into like new ways of looking at it. But I'm thinking of like out west where there's these sort of photo studios that still do stuff like this, where it will be like Old West styling and portraits for, again, tourists.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious, even if that's something that people are participating in now, either as people from somewhere else other than Western North America, if you're seeing similar practices kind of still being perpetuated, or if there are just other strange oddities that come from looking at this, not just in the period that I love that you're looking at, from like you were saying, the halftone printing kind of explosion. Yeah, that's my question.
Yeah, I feel like it's somewhat avoidable when I'm doing my kind of initial keyword searches to turn up more contemporary examples. One of them that obviously kept coming up when I'm looking at cultural cross-dressing in the context of kind of the Arab world is Justin Trudeau and his more recent scandal of his kind of Arabian Nights costume. Yes, so of course it's these putting on costumes is kind of an extremely old practice, but it's also stretches until today. It's very much alive, especially in a tourist context. And I think that part of the reason that I find it productive to think about it in terms of these travelogue books is because these people are presenting themselves as authors, right? So there is that kind of extra statement that they're making. It's not just about fun and games. Actually, it was also pretty like solemn and serious a lot of the time, and they're very self-promotional images. His authorities, exactly. Yeah. Ambling down the aisle.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. I had a question. In your research, did you come across any examples of authors in the other direction, Japanese authors who experienced the West and how that was constructed?
Yeah, that is a good question. There are examples. Of course, flipping between, if we're just imagining these very binary categories of East and West, the journeying between the two doesn't have the same meaning, right? So around this time, historically in Japan, the Meiji government is actually kind of instilling these laws where Japanese men are expected to start to wear Western suits, and it was put in place really as an attempt to what the Japanese government saw as enhancing their kind of credibility in this new international role that they were giving themselves. So yes, there were quite a few Japanese university students who would go study in the US or in Britain, and we see them wearing suits. So, but the meaning is different. That being said, I've also recently come across images of a Japanese man who was a merchant going between Japan and Turkey, and there's an image of him kind of in Oriental Turkish garb, and so those desires to like partake in the historical or traditional costumes of another place are, of course, not exclusive to Western travelers, I find kind of the significance of the images is slightly different, and there are less of them, although they are kind of fascinating examples that pop up.
So if there are any final questions, I just want to say thank you again to Stephanie. That was a wonderful closing presentation, and we will move now to the closing remarks from Eva.